They weren't stronger, but they defeated the most fearsome army in the world. What made that miracle happen?
You know, their name alone was enough to silence entire cities. The Mongol war machine, it just thundered across continents, from Asia all the way to Europe, shattering kingdoms that had stood for centuries. They were a force of nature.
And they built one of the largest land empires in all of human history, which, cemented this legendary reputation. The idea was they were utterly, completely unstoppable. Well, turns out, not exactly. Across the world, there were people who stood up to them. And they didn't always have bigger armies, but they had sharper minds, a tougher resolve, and sometimes a little help from Mother Nature herself. So let's dive into 5 incredible stories where the Mongol Empire was stopped dead in its tracks. Okay, so first up, let's head to the very edge of the Mongol frontier. We're talking about an island nation with this fierce, unbroken warrior pride, Japan. For the great Kublai Khan, Japan was just one more prize to add to his collection. So, that first invasion in 1274, it was a massive wake-up call for Japan. I mean, it showed them just how terrifying the Mongol threat really was. They were pushed right to the brink, and they were only saved by a sudden, colossal storm that just appeared out of nowhere. Spared by what felt like pure luck, the Japanese spent the next 7 years building up, fortifying their coasts, and training their troops like their lives depended on it, because they did. When the Mongols came back in 1281, they found a nation that was ready to fight. And get this, the scale of that second invasion was just staggering. We're talking over 1,000 warships. This wasn't some raid, this was a force meant to completely overwhelm and crush all resistance. For weeks, the samurai held them off, even launching these daring night raids in small boats. But just as it looked like their defenses were about to break, history didn't just repeat itself, it came back with a vengeance. Another typhoon, even more violent than the first, just boiled up from the sea. Can you imagine hundreds of warships just smashed to pieces against the reefs or literally swallowed by the waves? For the Japanese, this was nothing short of a miracle. They even gave it a name, the kamikaze, which means the divine wind. But for Kublai Khan, this was a humiliating, shocking defeat, delivered not by some rival army, but by the raw, untamable power of nature itself. All right, now let's shift gears and head west, over to the Indian subcontinent. Now, early Mongol raids here had kind of fizzled out again and again. You had the crushing heat, diseases they weren't used to, and these incredibly long supply lines that made it almost impossible to actually hold any territory. But by the late 13th century, they were about to face a totally new and far more formidable opponent. See, this wasn't just any old kingdom. This was the Delhi Sultanate, and it was led by a guy named Alauddin Khalji, a ruler who was every bit as ruthless and brilliant as any Mongol Khan you could name. And Khalji didn't just play defense. No, he proactively transformed his entire state into a hardened military machine, one designed specifically to break the Mongol horde. And it wasn't just him. His generals were just as fierce. Take Zafar Khan, for example. In 1299, you've got a Mongol army right at the gates of Delhi. He's ordered to hold his position, but does he listen? No way. Instead, he charges, smashing straight into the Mongol vanguard and shattering their morale at a really critical moment. Now, he did die in the fight, but that single defiant charge bled the invaders and became this legendary act of resistance. But in the end, it was Khalji's big picture reforms that really sealed the deal. A permanent, standing army, a whole network of fortified borders, and centralized control over all the food and supplies. He basically created a frontier that the Mongols just could not break. After a couple more crushing defeats, the empire that terrified the world turned its back on India for good. Okay, our next story of defiance takes us all the way to the island of Java. And this one starts not with a big battle, but with a major personal insult. When Kublai Khan's envoy shows up and demands her submission, the Javanese king, Kirtanagara, has the guy's face branded and sends him home. I mean, wow. For the great Khan, this was an unforgivable offense that demanded one thing, an invasion fleet. Here's the twist, though. By the time the Mongol fleet actually got there, the whole situation on the island had flipped. The king who made the insult, he was dead, overthrown by a rival. So, seizing on all this chaos, the dead king's son-in-law, a really cunning prince named Radin Wijaya, saw his chance. He goes to the Mongol commanders and makes them an offer. Help me defeat the guy who took the throne, and I'll make sure all of Java submits to the Great Khan. And believe it or not, the plan worked like a charm. The Mongols, who were just eager for a quick and easy win, totally agreed. Wijaya leads their army inland and uses their massive strength to crush his rival and retake the capital. The whole campaign seems to be over. But just as the Mongols are starting to celebrate, Wijaya turns on them, launching this surprise guerrilla attack that throws their entire camp into chaos. With the monsoon season about to hit and their forces in total disarray, the shocked Mongol commanders had no choice but to get out of there and flee the island. All right, let's pivot again, this time to the heart of the Middle East. After the Mongols had just brutally sacked Baghdad and Aleppo, it really seemed like nothing could stop them. Only one major power was left standing, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, this really disciplined military state that was actually forged by former slave soldiers. So, just as this massive Mongol army was getting ready to march on Cairo, some game-changing news arrived. The Great Khan was dead. Now, this meant that Hulagu Khan, the Mongol commander, had to take most of his army and head back east to sort out who was going to be the next leader. He left behind a much smaller force under his top general Kitbuka, and the Mamluk Sultan, Qutuz, knew this was it. This was his one and only shot. So Qutuz comes up with the perfect battle plan. At this place called Ain Jalut, his general, Baibars, leads a vanguard to attack the Mongols. They fight for a bit, then stage a fake retreat, pulling the overconfident Kitbuka and all his cavalry into a narrow valley. Once the Mongols were deep inside, fully committed to the chase, Qutuz sprung the trap. Hidden Mamluk forces poured down from the hills, completely surrounding and then annihilating the Mongol army. It was just a stunning, brilliant strategic victory that shattered that myth of Mongol invincibility in the West. And for our final story, we're heading to the dense jungles and winding rivers of Dai Viet, what we know today as Vietnam. And here, a resilient kingdom did the unthinkable. It fought off not one, not two, but 3 massive Mongol invasions. The question is, how on earth did they do it? Well, their success really came down to sheer resilience and a genius-level understanding of their own backyard. They flat out refused to meet the Mongol horde in a big open battle. Instead, whenever the invaders came, the Vietnamese court would just leave the capital. They'd evacuate everyone and take all the food with them. So the Mongols would march into a completely empty city with no supplies to take and no ruler to capture, all while getting harassed by constant guerrilla attacks from the jungle. It was a strategy that stretched their supply lines to the absolute breaking point.
And this whole strategy led to an absolutely incredible finale during that third invasion. As the exhausted Mongol army and their supply fleet tried to escape down the Bac Dang River, they sailed right into an ingenious trap. The Vietnamese general, Tran Hung Dao, had planted a field of iron-tipped stakes in the riverbed, totally hidden at high tide. He then used a small force to lure the Mongol fleet in, and then, as the tide went out, these massive warships were impaled and stuck on the stakes. Trapped and helpless, the fleet was completely annihilated, ending the Mongol threat to their kingdom for good.
So when you step back and look at all 5 of these stories, you start to see a pattern, right? This supposedly invincible empire could absolutely be stopped. It was checked by nature itself, those divine winds of Japan. It was outsmarted by cunning deception in Java and brilliant tactics at Ain Jalut, and it was outlasted by the hardened resolve of the Delhi Sultanate and the masterful guerrilla warfare of Dai Viet. And all of this really leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? These 5 defeats prove that even the mightiest war machine can be broken. By clever strategy, by local knowledge, by bold leadership, and sometimes by the simple, unbreakable will to resist. It really makes you think that maybe the true limits of power aren't found on any map, but in the boundless ingenuity of the human spirit.
Like and subscribe so your journey of exploring history with the turning point is never interrupted.